The day a stranger fell asleep on Jack Mercer's shoulder at 35,000 feet, he learned that a man can spend years being nobody's safe place and never once admit how badly he'd wanted to be one. His name was Jack Mercer. He was 39, and he ran a used bookstore in a small harbor town, a narrow brick storefront he'd inherited from his uncle, along with 40,000 books and a cat that had come with the building, and refused to acknowledge the change in ownership. It was honest work and quiet work, pricing estates, mending broken spines with linen tape, and patience, finding the one person in a year who actually wanted the obscure thing on the high shelf. He'd been alone for 3 years, since an engagement that ended not in a fight, but in a slow mutual admission that they'd both been settling and were both too polite to say so. He wasn't bitter about it. He was just tired in a low background way, the tired of a man who has stopped expecting the day to surprise him, who has organized his whole life so that nothing ever does. He was flying home from a book fair 2 states over, an aisle ticket he'd swapped at the last minute for a window because the gate agent had asked and he'd been too tired to care. The plane was full. The woman in the middle seat beside him had boarded late and flustered, a wheeled bag she'd had to gate check, a coat she couldn't fold right, eyes that were red in the specific way that has nothing to do with allergies. She'd murmured an apology for climbing over him, buckled in, and then sat very still with her hands pressed flat on her thighs, breathing the careful measured breaths of a person holding something together by force of will. Jack had clocked all of it the way he clocked everything, peripherally, without comment. And then he'd gone back to the paperback he wasn't really reading, because the kindest thing you can do for a person barely holding on is pretend you can't tell. They didn't speak for the first hour. She ordered nothing from the cart. He bought a coffee he didn't want so the attendant would have a reason to linger a second longer, near a woman who looked like she might need someone to. Somewhere over the dark middle of the country, the cabin lights dimmed and the engine settled into that deep, continuous hum that turns a metal tube into the most anonymous place on earth, and the woman beside him fell asleep. She didn't mean to. He felt the exact moment her body gave up the fight, the small lurch, as her head dropped, caught itself, dropped again, and then, by slow degrees, came to rest against his shoulder. She was out completely, the bottomless sleep of someone who hasn't slept properly in a long time. And Jack went absolutely still. His arm fell asleep within 20 minutes. He didn't move it. He sat there in the dark with a stranger's head on his shoulder and the recycled air cold on his face and the little reading lights making islands up and down the dim cabin. And he held his arm in one position for 2.5 hours because the alternative was to wake a woman who had clearly forgotten, somewhere over Nebraska, what it felt like to be safe enough to fall asleep. He thought about a lot of things in those 2.5 hours. He thought about how no one had needed anything from him in 3 years. Not really, not anything that cost him. He thought about how strange it was that the thing he'd missed most without knowing it was simply this, being leaned on. He read the same page of his paperback 11 times and absorbed none of it and watched the little plane icon crawl across the seatback map and felt absurdly like the most useful he'd been in months. The plane began its descent. The lights came up. The woman woke the way people wake on planes, with a jolt and then a horrified dawning understanding of where her head had been, and she sat bolt upright and pressed her hands to her face. "Oh my God," she said, mortified. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. How long was I?" "You're fine," Jack said. "You needed it more than I needed my arm." She laughed, a startled wet sound, and wiped under her eyes and looked at him properly for the first time. And Jack saw that she was perhaps 37, with dark hair that had escaped its clip, and a face that was pretty in the unguarded, undecorated way of a person who has stopped performing. She started to say something else, and the wheels touched down and the cabin filled with the noise of 100 people unbuckling at once, and the moment shattered into the ordinary chaos of arrival. She was up the second the seatbelt sign died, wrestling her coat on, more flustered than the landing warranted, and Jack understood that the mortification had tipped over into a need to flee. He stood to let her into the aisle, and as she pushed past him into the crush of people pulling bags from the overhead bins, she caught his hand, pressed something into his palm, folded paper, warm from her own hand, and closed his fingers around it with both of hers for half a second, and said very fast, not quite meeting his eyes, "I'm sorry. Thank you. I couldn't say it out loud." And then she was gone, swallowed into the deplaning crowd, and Jack stood there in the emptying row, holding a folded square of paper, and didn't open it until he was standing alone at the baggage carousel, watching other people's suitcases go by. On the paper, in handwriting that had been steadied by effort, it said, "I haven't slept in front of another person in 2 years. I've been too afraid. You didn't move for 2 hours so I wouldn't wake up. You don't know what you gave me. Thank you for being the first quiet thing in a long time. A stranger who is going to be braver from now on." There was no name, no number, nothing to find her by. Jack stood at the carousel reading it 4 times, and then he folded it back along its creases and put it in his breast pocket. Over his heart, the way you put something you've decided to keep, and he told himself that was that. A small grace from a stranger, the kind of thing that happens once and is meant to stay a once. He drove home. He opened the store the next morning. He put the note in the drawer under the register where he kept the things he couldn't throw away, and he did not, in fact, stop thinking about it. She walked into his store 3 weeks later. He was up the rolling ladder reshelving a run of water-damaged atlases when the bell over the door went, and he said, "Be right down," without looking, and a voice he knew, a voice he'd heard say, I couldn't say it out loud, said, "Take your time, I'm just hiding from the rain." And Jack came down that ladder faster than was strictly safe, and there she was, dripping on his welcome mat, a wheeled suitcase beside her because she'd come straight from her new apartment 2 streets over, having moved to the town 11 days ago to start a life that had nothing in it from before, and she saw his face, and her hand went to her mouth, and she said, "It's you, the shoulder." "Oh my God, it's the shoulder." "It's the shoulder," Jack agreed. Her name was Elena. She was 37. She'd moved to the harbor town because it was the furthest place she could afford from the city where she'd spent 6 years engaged to a man named Russ. No, Marcus. A man whose name she said the way you say the name of a weather system. Marcus had never hit her. She said that first, the way women say it first, as a kind of disclaimer, a way of getting ahead of the doubt. He'd just had opinions, about her friends which she'd slowly lost, about her clothes, about whether her job mattered, about how she laughed too loud at dinners and embarrassed him. He'd been calm and reasonable about all of it, so calm and so reasonable that for 6 years she'd believed she was the difficult one, until the morning she'd woken up and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd fallen asleep before he had, because falling asleep first meant being unconscious in a room with someone who made her feel like she was always one wrong move from a quiet, devastating correction. She'd left in March. She'd been on that flight running, with everything she could carry, to a town she'd picked off a map because it had a harbor and she'd always wanted to live near water. "And I fell asleep on a stranger," she said, hugging a coffee Jack had made her in the little kitchen at the back of the store, the rain still streaking the front windows, the shop smelling of old paper and dust and wet wool. "First time in 2 years I slept in front of another person, on the shoulder of a man whose name I didn't even know." She looked around at the warm cave of books, the brass lamp on the counter, the cat who had appeared from nowhere and was assessing her. "I didn't know it was your store. I swear, I just needed somewhere out of the rain that didn't feel like," she searched for it, "that didn't feel like it wanted anything from me." "Books don't want anything from you," Jack said. "Worst customers in the world. They just sit there." She laughed, the real one, the one he'd heard on the plane, and Jack felt the same useless, enormous gladness he'd felt at 35,000 feet, the gladness of being, for one more moment, a quiet thing in a loud life. She came back. Of course she came back. She started coming in on the slow afternoons, ostensibly to buy books and actually to sit in the worn armchair by the window with the cat on her lap, reading, while Jack worked the counter and they talked in the easy, intermittent way of two people who have somewhere comfortable to put silence. He learned that she'd been a graphic designer and was trying to go freelance now, building it back from nothing. He learned she took her coffee with too much sugar and was unapologetic about it. He learned that she flinched, almost invisibly, when a man's voice got loud in the street outside, and that she hated that she flinched, and that she was working on it. He told her about the bookstore, about his uncle, about the engagement that ended in politeness. He did not tell her the note was in the drawer 6 feet from where she sat. That felt like too much to hold up to the light yet. There was an afternoon, maybe the 4th week, when an estate came in. A whole life's worth of books in cardboard boxes, the library of a woman who died at 91, and Elena offered to help him sort them because the shop was dead and the rain had her stuck inside anyway. They worked through it on the floor, box by box, the dusty smell of other people's reading rising up around them, Jack telling her which ones had value and which were just sentiment, and Elena going quiet over a stack of paperbacks with a particular name written inside every front cover in fading fountain pen. She signed all of them, Elena said, holding one open, her own books, in her own house. "Who does that?" She ran her thumb over the ink, like she was afraid someone would say they weren't hers. Jack looked at the name a long moment, or like nobody ever asked her what she thought, he said. So she told the only thing that would listen. He took the book gently from Elena's hands and set it on the keep pile instead of the sell pile, and didn't explain why, and didn't have to. Elena was quiet for a while, sorting. Then she said, not looking up, "Marcus used to tell me I read too much, that I lived in my books, like it was a flaw, like having an inner life was a thing you should apologize for." She set a book down. "It took me leaving to understand he didn't hate that I read. He hated that there was a room in me he couldn't get into." She finally looked at Jack. Sometimes the thing they criticize most is just the part of you they can't control. I spent 6 years trying to read less to make a man comfortable. God, the part of you somebody tries hardest to shrink, Jack said, taping a cracked spine, is usually the part worth the most. They just want it to themselves or they want it gone. There's no third option with people like that. He smoothed the tape down. You read exactly the right amount. She didn't say anything to that, but she stayed until closing, and when she left she took the signed 91-year-old's paperback with her, the one Jack had set on the keep pile, and she didn't ask if she could, and Jack didn't mention that he saw, and that was its own kind of conversation. There was an evening in the 5th or 6th week when the rain came down hard enough to flood the gutters and she'd stayed past closing, and Jack made them grilled cheese on the little 2-burner in the back. And they ate it sitting on the floor between the poetry section and the staff pick table because there was nowhere else to sit, the rain hammering the roof, a single work lamp throwing everything into warm gold and long shadow. And Elena, picking at the crust of her sandwich, said the hard thing. "Can I ask you something? And will you not be nice about the answer?" Jack nodded. "Why didn't you move your arm? On the plane, be honest. Was it just politeness? Were you just trapped and being a gentleman about it?" Her eyes came up. "Because I've built something in my head out of that 2 hours. And I need to know if I'd built it out of nothing. If you were just a stuck man being polite. Tell me now, before this gets any bigger than it already is." Jack set his sandwich down. He thought about lying, about making it small and safe, and then he thought about a woman who'd spent 6 years being told her feelings were too big and decided he would not be one more man who made her feel like her reading of a moment was wrong. "I didn't move my arm," Jack said, "because for 3 years nobody has needed me for anything that cost me anything. And you fell asleep on my shoulder like you'd decided I was safe, and He stopped, started again. "I would have held that arm there until it fell off. It was the most useful I've felt in years, so no. It wasn't politeness, you didn't build it out of nothing. I've still got the note in a drawer. I read it more than I'll admit." He met her eyes. "You didn't imagine it. I just didn't have a name to chase you with. I figured that was the end of it. I'm fairly glad it wasn't." The rain filled the silence. Elena's eyes were bright. She set down her crust. "I'm tired," she said quietly, "of being too afraid to want the obvious thing." But she didn't move, and Jack didn't move because he'd understood something about her in 6 weeks, that the whole point, the entire repair, depended on her being the one who closed the distance, on her body learning that she could reach for something and not be corrected for it. So he waited. He was good at waiting. He'd held an arm still for 2.5 hours. And then Marcus came to town. He found her, the way men like Marcus always find the woman they've decided still belongs to them. A forwarded address, a mutual friend with a loose mouth, a 6-hour drive made to look casual. He came into the bookstore on a Saturday afternoon, when it was busy, because men like Marcus prefer to do their work where a woman can't make a scene without becoming the scene. He was polished. Pressed shirt, good watch, a calm warm smile that didn't reach anything. He walked up to Elena where she sat in the window chair, and he said gently, reasonably loud enough to carry, "There she is, Ellie. You had everyone worried sick. This was dramatic even for you. Come on, get your things, we'll talk in the car." And Jack watched Elena go small. He watched 6 weeks of repair fall off her in a second, watched her hands start to set down her book, watched the old obedience reach up through her like a reflex, and he felt something go cold and clear and very steady in his chest. He came around the counter, but he did not stand in front of her. He stood beside her, close, his shoulder near her shoulder, and he said nothing because it was not his scene to take. Marcus turned the warm smile on him. "And you are the man who owns the building you're standing in." Jack said, "Which is the only thing about this that's my business. The rest of it's hers." "This is a private family matter," Marcus said, the warmth cooling a degree. "Funny," Jack said, even and unhurried, the way he'd talk a customer down off a haggling fight he wasn't going to lose. "She lives alone, 2 streets over, in an apartment she pays for. You drove 6 hours to a town she chose specifically so you wouldn't be in it. There's no family here. There's just a man who can't stand that someone got out of range." He let it sit. "You came to do this in a crowd so she couldn't say no without an audience. So let's give you the audience." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Say what you came to say. We can all hear you. That's because you think a no in front of strangers is harder for her to mean. It isn't. It's just harder for you to ignore." The shop had gone quiet. Marcus's smile had curdled at the edges, and that was the tell. That was the crack in the polish, the thing that always showed up when calm and reasonable stopped working, the flicker of the man underneath, who had never once in 6 years been told no in a room he couldn't control. And Elena stood up. She stood up out of the window chair and she put her book down on the seat, and she did not look at Jack because she'd decided in that instant, she told him later, that she would not be a woman who got rescued, not again, not by anyone, not even by someone kind. She looked at Marcus. "I slept on a stranger's shoulder," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "3 weeks after I left you, a man I'd never met. And it was the safest I'd felt in 6 years, Marcus. A stranger on a plane was safer than my own fiancé." She picked up her coffee with a hand that was steady. "That's not dramatic, that's just true. You should sit with how true it is on the drive back, because I'm not getting in the car. I'm never getting in the car. And the only reason you flew all this way is that somewhere in you already knew that, and you couldn't stand it." She set her jaw. "Go home, Marcus. There's nothing here that's yours." For a long moment, nobody breathed. And then Marcus did the thing that men like Marcus do when the comm stops working, and the audience is turned and there's no version of the next 10 seconds where he comes out the way he came in. He laughed, short and ugly, muttered something about her being just as unstable as ever, and walked out, the bell jangling hard behind him. The shop exhaled. Somewhere in the stacks, an old man who'd been pretending to browse said quietly, "Good for you, miss," and the whole store almost laughed. Elena sat back down in the window chair very suddenly, like her legs had decided they were done, and Jack crouched beside her and said, "You okay?" And she looked at him, and there were tears running freely now, but they were a different kind, and she said, "I did that. You didn't do that. I did that." And Jack said, "You did all of it. I just stood next to you." And Elena reached out then, finally on her own time, in her own moment, and took a fistful of his shirt and pulled him in and kissed him. Hard in the window of a bookstore in the gray afternoon light, the rain starting up again on the glass, the cat watching from the staff-picked table with profound disinterest. And Jack kissed her back like a man who had been holding an arm perfectly still for 6 weeks, and was finally allowed to move it. When she pulled back, she kept her hand fisted in his shirt, like she wasn't done deciding to keep him. "For the record," she said breathless, "I'm not made of glass. I just spent 6 years being handled like I was. There's a difference. Don't get them confused." "I noticed," Jack said. "I'm good at noticing. Worst thing about me. The seasons turn the way they do when you finally let the day surprise you." Elena's freelance work found its feet, and her drawings started showing up framed on the bookstore walls. And then she had a little drafting desk in the back room next to the linen tape and the spine clamps, the two of them working in the same warm cave of paper on the slow afternoons. She stopped flinching at loud voices in the street mostly, and the time she did, Jack learned to just put a hand flat between her shoulder blades, steady, no words, the human equivalent of not moving his arm. The cat decided she lived there now. She did. There were small evenings that made a life. Elena reading aloud from the staff picks while Jack mended spines, doing all the voices badly. Sunday mornings walking down to the harbor with coffee to watch the boats, her head on his shoulder on purpose now, electively a thing she'd reclaimed. A dinner where she laughed too loud at something and then froze, the old fear surfacing, and Jack just laughed louder on purpose, until the fear had nowhere to stand. The night she fell asleep in the window chair with the cat on her lap and Jack closed the shop around her quietly, dimming the lamps one by one, and sat behind the counter doing the books just so she could sleep in a room with someone again and wake up unafraid. And she did, hours later, and found him still there and understood she'd never have to flee a sleeping room again. There was a morning the next spring when Elena came down to open the store and found that Jack had taken the note out of the drawer under the register, the folded square of paper soft now from handling, and had it framed, small in plain dark wood, and hung it on the wall behind the counter where he'd see it every day. And tucked into the corner of the frame was a second piece of paper, his handwriting this time, and it said, "You said you were going to be braver from now on. You were. You're the bravest person I know. Marry me." A stranger who would hold his arm still forever. And when she turned around, eyes streaming, Jack was standing in the poetry section with a ring and a face that wasn't tired at all anymore. And he said, "You did the brave thing the day you slipped me that note with no name. You bet everything on a quiet stranger being worth it. I'm just asking you to make the same bet one more time, except now you know my name." And Elena, the one who had learned finally that she was allowed to reach for the thing she wanted, crossed the bookstore and reached for it, and said yes between the shelves with the rain on the windows and the cat asleep in a sunbeam, and the note watched from the wall. They married down at the harbor in summer, near the water she'd picked off a map, a small thing, a handful of new friends and an old man who'd once said, "Good for you, miss," and had become a regular. Marcus didn't come, was never going to come, was a weather system that had passed. And Jack, standing by the water with a woman who'd once fallen asleep on his shoulder because she'd decided, on no evidence at all, that he was safe, understood the only thing the whole strange chance of it had been trying to teach him, that the people who make you feel safest aren't the ones who never let you fall asleep, but the ones who will hold still for 2.5 hours so you can. So here's what he'd ask you. What would you have done, sitting in that seat at 35,000 feet, when a stranger's head came to rest on your shoulder and your arm began to ache? Would you have shifted away, or would you have held perfectly still? And have you ever in your own life had a stranger be kinder to you in a single quiet moment than the people who were supposed to love you, a small grace from someone who owed you nothing, that you've never forgotten? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.